having me today. It's really nice to be here, and some really good work. A tall task to follow, I think. So I will try and proceed to show you some of the work that we've been doing over the past kind of 6 to 12 months with my colleagues, some of which are on the call today. So I think I won't touch too much on the background, but as Irene mentioned, I think the concept introduced not that long ago, it's not really there to, not really brought this up really to discuss it in any great detail, other than to kind of just touch on the fact I think it is a really brave decision from a political level to actually try and introduce a concept like this. I think it's even braver to try and put it into a policy, and I think that actually there should be. I think it's a huge challenge. The scale of the challenge, it really is massive, but I think it's one that is absolutely worth doing. There's examples from all over the world of this idea in its many different names being applied primarily to cities, which I think is, or regions, which I think is obviously is also an important factor to consider, not an entire country in many cases. So kind of tasked with looking at this concept in Western Bartonshire, we kind of left a bit flummoxed with, well, where do we start? Understanding 15-minute cities in Paris, how does that relate to Western Bartonshire? And actually we realized that we really need to understand, well, where do we start? And one of the good things about 20-minute neighbourhoods as a concept is the kind of the fundamental variables that underpin the 20-minute neighbourhood or local living, but fundamentally the 20-minute neighbourhood are measurable. It's about people's homes, and it's about the services that support those homes. And importantly, the kind of critical criteria is distance and time. And importantly, it's about understanding distance as time. So it's not about how the crow flies, because not many of us can fly like crows. It's about understanding the network of routes and roads that we actually have available to move around a place. So from that, we set out a series of questions, which was primarily around, can we actually measure our own neighbourhoods and our own places within the council to understand how they function with regards to this idea. And I'll kind of focus really importantly to say, we are doing this from a local level within a council with elected members, with other service areas who are trying to make decisions with this policy. So this exercise, this work was not done for for it to be interesting. It was from the outset, it was very much done to support decision making at a local level. So we set out using a really simple mapping system. I'm happy to make it available to anyone who wants to see it on the call, which looks at really, this is a bit of a kind of proof of concept and testing the idea of a series of education sites, a walking route of 800 meters away from each of those sites, using the network that is available. And this all just uses ArcGIS, which a lot of the councils will have access to, creating a catchment and then overlaying all of the unique residential points over those catchments. And I suppose really that gave us a kind of a fundamental underpinning, which is, okay, there's a whole load of qualitative elements that need to be assessed as part of this. How do those networks, function? What are the different schools? How do they? What are their catchments, etc. But at a kind of quantitative level, we could actually measure and understand the catchment of different services within the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So we set out a relatively kind of typical series of sectors to form indicators, and through several versions of which we're on version 3.0, but I think we're probably on about 5.7 now, to be completely honest. We started with 9, and then I think it was 14, and now we're at a lot more, and we're at a level of detail of talking around non-denominational and denominational primary schools, given the demographics that we are working with. And from that, we've set up a dashboard. And what what happens when you then overlay, we map every instance of every indicator across the council area, and of course from that you then get thousands of catchment areas which are quite difficult to do anything with. until you then overlay all of the unique address points, and you ask each one in a kind of relatively binary way, do you overlap with the different services? And using ones and zeros, you start to get a score for each of the points. So we can start to see where you've got areas which are more green, which are areas which have got better access to services, and then you have areas that are red, which have got less access to services. Some of those are interestingly to do with proximity. Some of them are to do with actually urban design and road structures. If you need to walk around lots and lots of bends to get to a place, actually you might be quite close to somewhere, but it's really difficult to walk between A and B. Importantly, of course, we can actually click on any single one of those 47,683 points, I think is how many we have, and actually see what that specific point has access to. And there's 1,000 different things that we can actually use this for. I'm only going to touch on a few, but you can start to see where there is kind of trends in areas with access to health provision across a series of indicators, or education. Of course, underneath all of that is the SIMD data, and understanding that this is an incredibly complex issue, and we're talking about access to services, and we're also then need to understand the different deprivation indicators that are a part of that, which is a whole other conversation in itself, but just to kind of understand that they have to form part of this thinking. But other things that we're able to do with the tool, which Hussam and I have talked at length about previously, is really around service area and density of population as well, which I think is something which is often overlooked, or maybe not talked about quite as much within this conversation. So because we look at the catchment of a specific service, this is one of the medical centres in Dunbarton, and you can see the catchment of that area, and understanding the demographic data, you can start to see the exact population density of a service in a certain area, which of course then starts to lead into things like where are there other population densities that are of a sufficient scale to support a different service, because we have to be able to evidence those decision making, those decisions. So to circle back to, well, how are we using this at a local level? We are using this already, as well as simultaneously kind of pushing the research forward. It's forming part of development briefs, where rather than just selling a red line boundary and then having to deal with how that red line boundary comes forward through a planning application, we're starting to embed some of the outcomes of the tool within the particulars and the development brief of the site, so that we can start to direct the type of typology, density, parking numbers, etc., so that we're starting to kind of work further upstream and embed some of these ideas rather than trying to deal with them at a later date. We've also used the tool and a version of Matthew, my colleagues, developed a really good tool to map all of the vacant and derelict land. So we're using that tool to help support some recent successful funding bids. And we're also supporting colleagues in housing, health and social care partnership, as well as kind of employment. And it's kind of quite fascinating when you start giving people an accessible version of this tool and asking them to bring their opinion of dealing with things like employability in areas of Clydebank. And because all of a sudden they can see what previously they were trying to articulate, and you can bring that in, it's a really, the tool becomes the platform to have a really valuable conversation, but also to improve the decision making beyond that. I'm going to touch really quickly on this for the last kind of 5 minutes or so, which is that one of the things we've kind of developed this tool maybe 9 months or so ago. And actually, now that the NPF4 has come in, and now that we're trying to work with this on a kind of a bigger scale, what we're kind of starting to work with is the kind of incremental change and system change. And I think they're not an or, they are an and. I think it's about trying to understand the fact that we can improve our local places in the minutiae of how do you move from A to B between certain areas. But if we're going to address some of the climate change questions, we have to think at a system level also. So our tool, for example, allows us to say that street over there, if we opened up a pedestrian route from A to B, we can improve that area for those 8 houses. And that's a great thing to do. And we should definitely go and do that. But if we're going to actually question some of these challenges around emissions and car transport, I think we have to think a little bit bigger. Just as a point of reference, and I stole this off Hussam, so apologies, Hussam, but those 38% of our so transport is the biggest emitter in Scotland, or it was in 2020, and nearly 40% of those emissions from transport are from private car journeys. Nearly 40% of those journeys are less than 2 miles. So there is a huge opportunity if we can provide the opportunity to not use your car, to really challenge some of these or respond to some of these challenges that are of a pretty huge scale. But I think we need to do that on a bigger scale. We've done some research alongside this around kind of what might be considered as maybe kind of core services, things that are high trip generators, or things that relate to health, things that relate to making sure we safeguard the ability to travel sustainably in the future. And there is a direct correlation with access to transport and train stations. This is very much a hypothetical experiment, which looks at all of the train stations in the Glasgow city region. And we use that because we have that data available. We don't have all of the access to every single open space data for all of the other councils. So we just looked at train stations here, which is the red dots on the screen. The orange area is an 800-meter walking catchment, which is 10 minutes, round trip being a 20-minute neighbourhood. The blue and the pink sites then are the future allocated housing sites across the city region. The pink overlap in some way with the walking area, the walking catchment to the train station, and hypothetically speaking to then other core services that might be necessary to support different communities. The blue sites do not overlap with the walking area to a train station. And when you then break that down into the areas, and I've just put a rough idea of 50 dwellings per hectare as an average. You have a vast amount more sites across the Glasgow city region that do not overlay with access to key services, access to train stations. And I think if we want to ask those, we want to respond to the challenges of climate change, I think we have to talk at this scale. I'm sure most people will also attest to, I've been talking about this for a while now, and we've been working at a local level, council by council, and I think it's really interesting to hear Anthony say, this is how we're going to do 20-minute neighbourhoods. But I think if we're talking about the entire sector, and we're talking about how the country moves forward, I think having 32 different versions of everything I think it has value in the sense that every single area is going to have its intricacies. But I think there's also a challenge of how we move nationally with things like transport or infrastructure. But equally, I think for Scottish government or at a national level to try and prescribe exactly what the answer is or exactly what core services might be, given, as we've also seen today from the students and some of the areas in Argyll and Bute, how difficult and how different some of those areas are from maybe the more kind of urban centres, it's incredibly difficult at a national level to then think about what are the core services that relate to an entire country. But I think the regional level is therefore where there is the most value in tackling some of these bigger questions. Bigger questions, working at a scale which responds to the scale of the challenge. I'm hoping to hoping to have a conversation with with all of the councils that are in the city region. Hopefully that will be happening at some point soon. We have had a conversation with Clyde Plan and colleagues there to look at how we can facilitate that conversation at a regional level, and start to bring in the input of multiple critical bodies that then need to be a part of that conversation. You know, things like ScotRail. ScotRail don't plan council by council, they plan in regions, and we therefore need to have a clear approach to make sure that we provide housing in the right place for them to then manage an increase in service, which then provides a better service, which then reduces ticket prices, which then helps everybody to move and transition towards better transport choices, or with the bus network, or with Public Health Scotland. So the hope, I suppose, in the near future, as I say, anyone from those city regions, if you haven't heard from me yet, that's not because you've been ignored, it's because we've just been talking to Clyde Plan at the moment and hoping to then expand the conversation out. But the hope is to try and develop a baseline assessment tool, where we can start to talk, I suppose, the same language across a region. And I think, Hussam, it was quite interesting, your point before about, you know, do we leave it to the private sector? I think to a certain extent we have to leave some of it to the private sector. But I think if we can provide the right boundaries and the right parameters to work within, then it can be left to the private sector. I think it's where we have different versions of the same thing across different councils is where it will become incredibly difficult to deliver and meet some of the challenges. And I think if we can do both of those things and look at the granular detail at a local level, and improve things incrementally for existing neighbourhoods, but also then think about a system change level of new neighbourhoods, new communities, and where new housing is going to go, where's the next 100,000 homes going to be, then I think we have the best opportunity of reaching the kind of ambitious targets that were set. Thank you.